My favorite stand-up comedian, Eddie Izzard, has a bit about colonialism that I'm thinking about this Indigenous Peoples Day weekend. If you don't already know him, I hope you will. Eddie Izzard is a British comedian, and in his show Dressed to Kill, he talks about how the British Empire stole countries. He says, "We stole countries with the cunning use of flags. Yes, just sail around the world and stick a flag in. I claim India for Britain." And they're going, "You can't claim us, we live here. There's 500 million of us. Do you have a flag?" "We don't need a bloody flag. This is our country, you burb." "No flag, no country. You can't have one. These are the rules that I've just made up, and I'm backing it up with this gun." Please pardon my British accent, or lack thereof. I laugh every time I see this bit, but it's one of those like grimace laughs where you just go, yeah, that was bad. Understanding the history of our country is important. And recognizing and laughing at the absurdity of it helps. But if we want to build a future that is more just than the past, we need to understand the way the harms and the oppressions of the past continue to shape our future. Because it wasn't, of course, rules that the colonists had just made up that empowered them to steal land from people living there for centuries. I know I didn't learn about it this way in school, but it was thanks to the doctrine of discovery, which was a decree from the Pope, or a series of them in the 1400s, that said that all of the Christian kings of Europe had the right to take the lands and possessions of any non-Christian people and keep them forever. If the non-Christian inhabitants converted to Christianity, great, but otherwise they could be enslaved or killed. They were not understood as human. Reverend Mike Johnson describes it this way: "The doctrine of discovery became the legal basis for the discoveries of Columbus and others, and for the resulting attempts to conquer and colonize the Western Hemisphere, unleashing genocide on its people. It was also the legal basis for the slave trade. Its influence didn't remain in that distant past. It's still a source of oppression to this day. It became the basis of US Indian law beginning in 1823, when Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that, quote, Christian people who had discovered the lands of the heathens had assumed the right of dominion, and thus had diminished the Indians' rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations. He claimed Indians had merely a right of occupancy in their lands. This decision has never been overturned and is still cited on a regular basis in federal court, including, distressingly, by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 2005. Reverend Johnson concludes, responding to the requests of Indigenous peoples, several religious denominations have passed resolutions to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, including the Unitarian Universalists in 2012. These resolutions are a first step toward reckoning with this history of stolen lands and stolen children. When we understand the ways that our country has been built on the religious and legal grounding that white people, well, white men are superior, it helps us notice the way this continues to play out in our current society. This year is the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing at Plymouth, just a few miles from our church in Braintree. So it's especially poignant on this Indigenous Peoples Day to hone our focus on this huge area of history and current events down to our area of Massachusetts. Let's pay attention to the stories and symbols that we lift up, knowingly and unknowingly, that then shape our future. Since we started off by talking about flags, let's turn our attention to the state flag and seal of Massachusetts. Thank you, Alicia, for getting that up there so promptly. I don't know how many of us have actually taken a good look at it. I know I hadn't looked closely. The seal and the flag bearing it feature a disembodied sword-wielding arm above a Native American. Alicia, if you'll go to the next slide, here's a bit about the imagery. The sword is modeled on a broadsword belonging to Plymouth Colony's military commander, Miles Standish, who was known as an Indian killer. I actually phoned my friend who works at Plymouth Plantation last night to make sure I got these details right. On one notable occasion, Miles Standish pretended to be a traitor to lure Witawamet, a Neponsit man, into a house, and then Standish beheaded him. He brought the head to Plymouth, where it was displayed on a wooden spike, along with a handkerchief soaked in Witawamet's blood, hung like a flag, for many years. And while this was a common kind of practice for retributive justice in England, it was also a symbol of white power. This is the sword on the flag that hangs over the head of this idealized Native American. The horseshoe of the state motto wraps around him in Latin, variously translated as something like, "By the sword we seek peace, but peace under liberty." Talk about what symbols we lift up. This image of colonization, subjugation, and violence is lifted up flagpoles in government offices and is stamped on our official documents. Is this the symbol that you, those of us who are residents of Massachusetts, want representing us? I don't. Alicia, you can take that down. Thank you. And that last graphic you can learn more from a link at the bottom of your order of service. Rich Barlow at NPR names the scope and importance of examining these symbols, saying, compared to some of the life-stunting scourges that are out there, criticism of the Massachusetts state seal and flag as demeaning to Native Americans admittedly can seem like swatting a fly amid a swarm of murder hornets. Yet, Barlow continues, as the welcome removal of monuments to the Confederacy and that treasonous regime's flags from NASCAR races and other places attest, symbols matter as material, micro and not so micro aggressions. They are mute transmitters that announce society's values. Activists have been advocating for years that the state change its flag and seal, introducing legislation into the State House every 2 years since 1984. Amid a blessedly growing wave of removing racist symbols, the Massachusetts State Senate voted unanimously this July to change the state flag and seal. And the House of Representatives now take it up. along with legislation that would ban the use of Native mascots in Massachusetts public schools. Given that Braintree and Quincy high schools are working on changing their mascot images and team nicknames away from harmful stereotypes of Native people, this is a live and relevant issue. It's important to note that removing racist and harmful symbols can be an easy out for powerful institutions that are still shying away from changing the systems that perpetuate inequality. But it is progress. And it's an important entryway into noticing what stories get lifted up. Our religious movement has roots in Europe and in the very Puritan communities that colonized this area. And so we have to name that Unitarian Universalists are a part of the culture that has benefited from this history of oppression. And so it's especially important for us to, first of all, learn a fuller history of what has happened on this soil. And for those of us who have white European ancestry, be open to hearing some uncomfortable and challenging truths. Second, we are called to notice how we tell that history through symbols and stories. And third, we need to change the narrative. I want to share with you a very different kind of story, one that focuses on revitalization and repair. This is the story of Jessie Little Doe Baird, who lives down on the Cape in Mashpee, the ancestral home and continued home of the Wampanoag people. In the 1990s, for 3 nights in a row, Jessie had a series of dreams. She saw her Wampanoag ancestors surrounding her, reaching out to her and speaking in a language that was familiar, but that she didn't understand. Jessie realized when driving by a Cape Cod road sign with a native town name that they had been speaking to her in Wampanoag, the ancient language of her people, which had died out sometime in the mid-1800s. She took it as a sign. A Wampanoag prophecy spoke of a time when their language would leave them, only to return when the people were ready. Jessie believed that her dreams were a message from her ancestors, telling her it was time. She went to the tribal elders and asked if they were ready for the language to come home. They were. Since then, Jessie has devoted her life to resurrecting Wampanoag, working toward the day when the language that greeted the pilgrims could once more be spoken aloud in southeastern Massachusetts. Her path has required one leap of faith after another, but she's had more successes than failures along the way. She's written a Wampanoag dictionary, gotten a master's degree in linguistics from MIT, and has even gotten a MacArthur Genius Grant. She and many volunteers, educators, and elders have started and grown the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project. There are so many poignant things about this story, but there are 2 that give me the goosebumps. First, when Jessie went to MIT for her linguistics fellowship, her advisor was Dr. Kenneth Hale. Hale was fluent in 50 languages and a master in his field, but what really gets me, he was a direct descendant of Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island and a missionary who helped translate religious materials into Wampanoag in an effort to civilize the natives. the descendant of Roger Williams and a member of the tribe that Williams aimed to convert, working together to revive this language, to preserve the culture that his ancestors sought to wipe out. And then there's May, Jessie Little Doe Baird's youngest daughter. Before 2004, there hadn't been a native speaker of Wampanoag born into the tribe for 6 generations. When May was born, Jessie marked the end of that sad legacy with a single word she spoke to her daughter. Kuikasun. Translated as, good morning, it literally means, you are in the light. From that first word, May was the first native speaker of Wampanoag in 7 generations. She was the language coming home. This is a story that I want lifted up. One of resilience, dedication, and repair. The story of the Wampanoag language reclamation is just one part of the remarkable journey of the Wampanoags, a tribe that has survived epidemics, war, enslavement, and the loss of their ancestral land. But today, their tribe is in the midst of a renaissance. It has received federal recognition from the US government, has opened a health clinic, and set up a language school, and also runs total immersion language camps. That friend who works at Plymouth Plantation says one of her native colleagues sends her son to the Wampanoag Montessori school. And not only is her son among that first new generation speaking Wampanoag as his first language, she says he might be the first one in more than 100 years to speak English with a Wampanoag accent. I love that. Learning more about the stories of the people whose land I live on calls me to be a part of the repair, a part of the revitalization. And even though my particular ancestors weren't among those first colonizers, I'm here now, and so are they. And we are all needed to support our Native communities. Even just this spring, some of you may remember on March 27th, 2020, just a few weeks into the pandemic here, which we should name has hit Native communities especially hard. In March, the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs informed the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribal Council that their reservation designation would be rescinded, that over 300 acres of their land would be removed from the federal trust. That decision would destroy much of what the tribe has worked to build in recent years on its sovereign lands. A federal court sided with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe in June, calling this attempt by the Trump administration to steal the land, quote, arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion and contrary to law. While the land is at least temporarily protected, we need to be vigilant, nimble, and ready to support our Native communities' sovereignty. My friends, symbols matter. The stories that we tell matter. We are living on land that has been stolen, in a country that was built upon the dehumanization of others. We are called to reckon with this. And yet, there is resilience and repair. Our faith calls us to throw our weight toward justice, equity, and the inherent worth and dignity of all people. May this Indigenous Peoples Day call us to learn the fuller stories, of those who have stewarded our lands for thousands of years and who continue to lead in the struggles for building more just systems. And may it call us to follow their lead to a better future for us all. So may it be.